Every year, millions of people walk through an airport named Rommel, not the Nazi field marshal, his son, because while most families connected to the Third Reich were crushed after 1945, the Rommel family did something no one expected. The field marshal's teenage son deserted the Wehrmacht, befriended the sons of his father's greatest enemies, and made a decision in 1977 so controversial it nearly ended his career. A decision that only makes sense when you know how his father really died. The lie that saved a family. October 14th, 1944, a 15-year-old boy named Manfred watches from the upstairs window as two generals step out of a car and walk toward the front door. They haven't come for tea. Downstairs, his father, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the most famous soldier in Germany, already knows why they're here. The regime had linked Rommel to the July 20th plot, the failed assassination attempt against Hitler 3 months earlier. The evidence was thin, drawn mostly from the confessions of conspirators who may have named Rommel under torture. But in the Third Reich, suspicion was enough. The generals presented Rommel with two options. The first, a trial before the People's Court, presided over by the fanatical Roland Freisler. A public spectacle that would end in execution and in the arrest, imprisonment, or worse of Lucy and Manfred. The regime would strip the family of everything: their name, their pension, their safety. The second option, a cyanide capsule. Take it now, and the official story would be that Rommel died of wounds sustained in an Allied air attack months earlier. He would receive a state funeral with full military honours. Lucy would keep her pension. Manfred would be left alone. Rommel chose the capsule. He said goodbye to his wife. He told Manfred what was happening, that in 15 minutes he would be dead. Then he walked to the waiting car with the two generals, was driven down the road and swallowed the poison. Within the hour, the Wehrmacht announced that Field Marshal Rommel had succumbed to his injuries. The Führer expressed his deepest condolences. It was a lie from start to finish, but that lie became the Rommel family's life insurance. The Nazis got their hero's funeral, their propaganda moment, their image of a loyal soldier fallen in service to the Reich. And Lucy and Manfred got to survive the final months of the war without being branded traitors' kin, without being hunted, arrested, or sent to a camp. The same deception that killed Erwin Rommel is what saved his family. And the boy who watched his father leave the house that morning would spend the rest of his life reckoning with what that meant. The teenage deserter. Manfred Rommel had not been a bystander during the war. He'd been a Luftwaffe auxiliary at 14, assigned to an anti-aircraft battery while still in school. By early 1945, as the Reich crumbled, he was conscripted into the Reich Labour Service, another teenage body thrown at the collapsing front. But as April brought Allied armies deeper into southern Germany, Manfred made a choice his father never could. He deserted. Near Riedlingen, in the chaos of a disintegrating army, he slipped away from his unit and was quickly picked up by advancing French forces. He was a prisoner of war at 16 years old. What happened next changed everything. During his interrogation, Manfred was brought before General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny himself, one of France's most senior commanders. And instead of staying silent or repeating the regime's cover story, Manfred told the truth. He described the two generals arriving at the family home, the ultimatum, the cyanide capsule, the staged funeral. For the first time, the real story of Erwin Rommel's death left the family. This teenager, a deserter, a prisoner, the son of the most celebrated German general of the war, had just handed the Allies the truth that the Nazi regime had worked so hard to bury. And with that act, the Rommel name began a transformation that nobody could have predicted. It stopped being the name of a Wehrmacht legend and started becoming something far more complicated, a name tied not to blind loyalty, but to the cost of defying it, rebuilding in the rubble. When the war ended, Lucy Rommel was left alone with her grief and a pension that existed only because her husband had agreed to die quietly. She lived out the post-war decades in southwest Germany, avoiding public life almost entirely. She gave no major interviews, published no memoirs, and sought no spotlight. American and British intelligence officers questioned her in the months after the surrender, but she was never charged with anything. There was nothing to charge her with. She had been a soldier's wife in a regime that destroyed her husband, and the state funeral that disguised his murder had, ironically, shielded her from the retribution that engulfed other families connected to the Nazi elite. Lucy died in 1971, in Stuttgart, largely forgotten by the public. The woman who had stood in the doorway on October 14, 1944, and watched her husband walk to his death, never recovered from that moment, but she also never became a symbol of anything. She simply disappeared into the quiet anonymity of post-war Germany. Manfred took a completely different path. After his release from French captivity, he threw himself into rebuilding. Not the old Germany, but the new one. He completed his Abitur in 1947 at Biberach an der Riss, enrolled to study law at the University of Tübingen, and by 1956 had entered the civil service. Step by step, the Field Marshal's son was embedding himself inside the very democratic institutions that had replaced everything his father had fought for. He married Liselott in 1954 and settled into the kind of steady, unglamorous career that no one would have expected from a Rommel. He wasn't running from his name, he was quietly redefining it. But what Manfred did next with that name is what nobody could have predicted. The son who ran Stuttgart. In 1974, Manfred Rommel was elected Oberbürgermeister of Stuttgart, running as a member of the conservative CDU party. On paper, it was a natural fit, a respectable, law-trained civil servant from a prominent family running for local office in southwest Germany. But the way Manfred actually governed was anything but conservative. He became a champion of modern infrastructure, pushing through the Stuttgart S-Bahn commuter rail system in 1978 and investing in international cultural venues that transformed the city's profile. He approached urban planning with a vision that was decades ahead of most German mayors. More significantly, he governed a city with one of the highest proportions of foreign residents in West Germany, and rather than treat immigration as a problem to manage, he embraced it openly. He became known as one of the most pro-immigration, liberal-minded politicians in the country. Think about that for a moment. The son of Hitler's star field marshal, the man whose name was synonymous with the Afrika Korps and Panzer warfare, was running one of Germany's most diverse cities and thriving at it. He served for 22 years, becoming one of the most popular municipal politicians in the country's history. His trademark was dry Swabian humour and a legendary frugality that bordered on comedy. He reportedly made half a butterless pretzel the standard refreshment at official city receptions, a detail that delighted Stuttgart residents and horrified visiting dignitaries in equal measure. But Manfred's popularity wasn't built on charm alone. It was built on a quiet, consistent belief that democratic governance required generosity of spirit, especially from people whose families had once stood on the wrong side of history. And it was a friendship he forged during those years that proved just how far he was willing to take that belief. A friendship nobody saw coming. During his time as mayor, Manfred Rommel developed close personal friendships with two men whose surnames should have made any relationship impossible. The first was George Patton IV, the son of General George S. Patton, the American commander who had chased Erwin Rommel across North Africa and Sicily. The second was David Montgomery, the son of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British officer who finally defeated Rommel at El Alamein in 1942. The men whose fathers had tried to kill each other across the deserts of Libya and Tunisia were now friends. They visited one another, attended events together, and built genuine bonds that went beyond diplomatic courtesy. For Manfred, these friendships were not just personal, they were symbolic. They represented the kind of reconciliation that post-war Europe was supposed to embody, but rarely achieved at such a personal level. The wartime rivalry between Rommel, Patton and Montgomery had become one of the defining narratives of the Second World War. 1 generation later, their sons turned that rivalry into an image of a healed continent. The Rommel name stopped being associated purely with the Wehrmacht and became, for many, a symbol of what moving forward actually looked like. But Manfred's most defining moment was still ahead of him, and it had nothing to do with old wars. The burial that shocked a nation. By 1977, West Germany was in crisis. The Red Army faction, the Baader-Meinhof group, had been waging a campaign of bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings that terrorized the country. That autumn, the crisis reached its peak. On October 18th, 3 imprisoned RAF leaders, Andreas Baader, Gudrun Enslin, and Jan Karl Raspe, were found dead in their cells at Stammheim prison in Stuttgart. The official verdict was suicide, though controversy surrounded the deaths for decades. Germany was divided over what to do with the bodies. No city wanted them. The idea of burying terrorists on German soil provoked outrage from conservatives, law enforcement officials, and much of the public. The bodies sat unclaimed as municipalities refused to act. Then, Manfred Rommel stepped forward. As Mayor of Stuttgart, he ordered the 3 buried together at the city's Dornhaldenfriedhof cemetery. The outcry was ferocious. Conservatives were appalled. Political allies distanced themselves. Critics accused him of legitimizing terrorism, of disrespecting the victims of RAF violence, of making Stuttgart a monument to murderers. It was the single most controversial decision of his career, and potentially the end of it. Manfred's response was a single devastating principle. After death, every enmity must end. Consider what that statement meant coming from him. This was a man whose father had been forced to swallow poison by his own government, and then given a fraudulent funeral designed to serve the regime's propaganda needs. Erwin Rommel had been denied a truthful burial. His death had been dressed up as something it was not, his memory manipulated for political convenience. His son had watched this happen at 15 years old. Now, 3 decades later, that same son insisted on dignified burial for people most of Germany considered monsters. Not because he sympathized with their cause. He was a conservative mayor who had condemned RAF violence in the strongest terms. But because he believed that what you do with the dead reveals what kind of society you are, and a society that refuses burial to its enemies is a society still governed by the logic that killed his father. That is the moment where Manfred Rommel's entire life clicks into focus, a quiet, lifelong repudiation of the world that destroyed his family. But the Rommel story had one more chapter that nobody knew about until the year 2000. The secret daughter. For decades, a woman named Gertrude appeared in the Rommel household, introduced to visitors as Cousin Gertrude. She was treated as extended family, present at gatherings, welcome in, the home, trusted with private moments. She sat at Erwin Rommel's hospital bedside when he was recovering from his injuries in 1944. On at least one occasion, she answered the telephone when an enraged Adolf Hitler called the house, demanding that Rommel return immediately to North Africa. But Gertrude was not a cousin. She was Erwin Rommel's daughter. Born on December 8, 1913, Gertrude was the child of Walburga Stemmer, a young woman Rommel had been involved with while stationed at Weingarten before the First World War. Around the year 2000, a cache of letters surfaced, over 150 of them, written by Rommel to Walburga during those early years. In them, he called her his little mouse and wrote about his dreams of building a little nest for her and the baby. The letters painted a portrait of genuine affection, even tenderness, a side of the disciplined military officer that the public myth had never included. But the relationship did not survive. Rommel married Lucy Mollin in 1916, and, when Lucy became pregnant with Manfred in 1928, while Bürger's position became untenable, she died that same year. The official cause was pneumonia, but it was widely believed, then and now, that she had taken her own life. Gertrude was absorbed into the Rommel household under the fiction of a cousin. She lived her entire life in the shadow of her father's public image, the devoted husband, the family man, the honourable soldier. The letters were eventually inherited by Gertrude's son, Joseph Pan, who brought them to light and documented a relationship that the Rommel family had concealed for nearly a century. The carefully constructed image of the loyal family man, the same image that had anchored the post-war Rommel myth, had been hiding a second family all along. The myth machine. This is where the story demands a wider lens. The Rommel family didn't just survive the post-war period, they actively participated in shaping how the world remembered Erwin Rommel, and in doing so, they helped construct one of the most powerful narratives in modern German history. The idea of Rommel as the good German general, honourable, chivalrous, apolitical, a man who fought cleanly and resisted Hitler from within, became a cornerstone of what historians call the clean Wehrmacht myth. This was the narrative that allowed West Germany to reintegrate former military officers into democratic society without forcing a full reckoning with what the Wehrmacht had actually done. If Rommel could be an honourable soldier despite serving Hitler, then perhaps others could be too. Lucy and Manfred both contributed to this narrative. They foregrounded Erwin's supposed chivalry in North Africa, his distance from Nazi ideology, and his connection to the July 20th plot, framing him as a man who had been murdered by the regime precisely because he stood against it. The story was compelling and emotionally satisfying, and much of the Western public embraced it. But historians still debate how much of this was true and how much was strategic self-presentation. Rommel had served the regime faithfully for years. He had accepted gifts, promotions, and honours from Hitler personally. His connection to the July 20 conspirators was real but ambiguous. He may have known about the plot without actively joining it. The family shaped the archive as much as they drew from it, choosing which letters to publish, which stories to tell, and which inconvenient facts, like the existence of Gertrude, to leave buried. None of this erases what the Nazis did to Rommel in the end. The forced suicide was real, the cover-up was real, the grief was real. But the myth that grew from that grief served purposes that extended far beyond one family's need to make sense of their loss. What the name means now. Stuttgart Airport was renamed Manfred Rommel Flughafen in 2014, the year after Manfred's death at age 84. Not for the field marshal, for the mayor. The Rommel name travelled from the deserts of North Africa to a civilian terminal in democratic Germany, and it got there through a teenager's desertion, a liberal's moral courage, and a family secret hidden for nearly a century. Every year, passengers walk through that terminal without knowing the story behind the name on the building. They don't know about the cyanide capsule, the two generals at the front door, or the 15-year-old boy watching from the window. They don't know about cousin Gertrude, or the letters to the little mouse, or the butterless pretzels at city receptions. The field marshal's legacy is still debated, and it should be. The clean Wehrmacht myth did real damage, and the Rommel family's role in constructing it deserves honest scrutiny. But his son's legacy is remarkably clear. Manfred Rommel spent a lifetime proving something that most families connected to the Third Reich never attempted: that you can inherit a name without inheriting its sins, if you're willing to spend every day demonstrating what that name means now instead of defending what it meant then. He buried terrorists with dignity because his father was denied it. He befriended the sons of enemies because he understood that war doesn't have to be inherited. And he governed a diverse modern city because he believed democracy was not just a system of government. It was a daily choice to be better than the world you came from. Manfred Rommel died on November 7, 2013. The airport was renamed the following year, and the name that once echoed across the battlefields of North Africa now greets travellers arriving in one of Europe's most welcoming cities. A quiet, final transformation that the Field Marshal could never have imagined, but that his son spent a lifetime earning. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, check out our other deep dives into the families who shaped World War II. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an upload.